PNG, he tells how those who were born in the southern half of PNG, the former territory of Papua, were legally and officially, until 1975, citizens of Australia.
It's got the curiosity of a lot of
Some 28 years after independence, Jonathan Barre has started a crusade to wind back the clock, to try to get his Australian citizenship back.
They're incensed about being denied this knowledge that they're basically being ignorant. So what they're saying is they're supporting me and they want Australia to acknowledge or give them the right of recognition to choose.
Jonathan and his supporters are now conducting rallies in and around Port Moresby, making Papuans aware of the claims on their rights. He says there may be up to 1.5 million people affected. Associate Professor of Law at the University of Melbourne, Kim Rubenstein, has spent years investigating the laws of citizenship in Australia and other countries.
The actual status was only created in 1948, but the actual Citizenship Act doesn't lead to explicit rights or responsibilities that flow from it.
But as a matter of colonial policy and later migration policy, Papuan-born Australians did not have an automatic right to enter mainland Australia.
Before Papua became independent, there was a policy that was applied by the Australian government that they didn't necessarily allow Papuan-born Australian citizens an immediate right of entry, and that was never challenged as a matter of law during that time, and the question is whether that policy was in fact lawful.
And that's a battle Jonathan Barre wants to fight. He's already taken initial steps from Australia. But Jonathan Barre, however, is undeterred.
Why was there a distinction between Anglo-Papuans and Indigenous Papuans? Why was there a distinction between mainland Australia and Papua when the law doesn't say that?
This is Shane McLeod in Port Moresby for AM.
Australian citizens. Most people think that prior to independence in 1975, Papua New Guinea was an Australian colony, but it's more complicated than that. The northern half of the island, New Guinea, was an Australian colony, but the lower half, Papua, was an Australian territory, and therefore people born in Papua were born Australian citizens, like people born now in the Northern Territory or the ACT. When Papua and New Guinea were merged into the independent nation of Papua New Guinea in 1975, a complicated set of laws and policies were put in place regarding citizenship. But Australian Papuans believe that they, and up to 1.5 million other Papuans, were never given the chance to choose between their Australian birth and the new nation of PNG. The charge is being led by a Papuan named Jonathan Barre. He says that in 1975 it should have been his right to choose.
All I am asking for is a recognition of that right and an option and a choice now that I am aware of that right to make my decision whether I want to continue to have my birth citizenship as opposed to my natural citizenship, which is a Papua New Guinean one.
Despite it being nearly 30 years since Papua New Guinea became independent, the law has never been fully tested. Kim Rubenstein was a citizenship law expert from Melbourne University.
I certainly think that there are some unresolved issues in relation to the position of people born in Papua who got Australian citizenship by birth in Papuan territory.
In 1975, both Australia and Papua New Guinea enacted legislation to deal with citizenship issues. And despite it being the dying days of the White Australia policy, the issue of race figured heavily in their considerations. The challenge was to allow white, colonial Papuans to easily maintain their Australian citizenship while at the same time converting the Indigenous Papuans from Australians into Papua New Guineans. The solution was to say that those Papuans who had a right of permanent residency in Australia would keep their Australian citizenship. So which Papuans had this so-called right to permanent residency? According to official government policy guidelines at the time, right of permanent residence in mainland Australia was automatic for children born in Papua of non-Indigenous descent. As for Indigenous Papuans, government policy gave the Minister the discretion to grant the right of permanent residence to such persons on application if they had been brought up in a European manner, had English as their principal language, and were European in outlook. So the policy of the time is as clear as bells. But what about the law? Kim Rubenstein.
And in 1975, there was no actual restriction formally in law on Australian citizens being permanent residents in any part of Australia. So the argument on the behalf of the Papuans would be that even though that might have been a policy issue at the time, it doesn't actually relate to the law, and that in terms of their legal status, that they haven't actually lost their Australian citizenship.
Jonathan Bowray plans to use this distinction between policy and law as a principal argument.
There are laws that actually made us Australian citizens, but it are policies that have stopped us from being recognized as Australian citizens. Policy that does not agree with the law is unconstitutional.
Bowray believes that saying some Papuans had a right to residency in mainland Australia while others didn't doesn't make any sense. At the time.
You cannot have two types of citizenship within a country. You cannot have one for non-Indigenous and one for Indigenous. We're all Australian citizens. You cannot have within Sydney, Australia, one citizenship, Australian citizen for the Asians, and one for the Lebanese, and one for the Anglo-Saxon. Everybody's an Australian citizen. And that's what my argument is about. You couldn't have within the citizenship, certain people had right of residence and certain people didn't have rights of residence. That is discrimination.